Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton. That will be the first and only time this morning that you will hear either one of their names from behind this pulpit. We are about to have a new president just a few days now. One of the candidates is going to be elected. But before we have our new president elected, I chose to write this sermon despite the outcome. The Bible speaks of some of the most greatest, glorious, trustworthy, honest, godly, amazing rulers of all time. It gives illustrations, examples, all of that. And the Bible also speaks of some of the most violent, reckless, angry, nasty, horrid rulers of all time. It does also speak of those. The Bible is relevant. And because it's relevant, we will be thinking about today how it's going to apply to us. The Bible both gives instruction and prepares us and gives us readiness to respond to rule. We are in a series. I don't know if those slides are working. If yes, you could pop those up. If not, that's okay too. We're in a series. We're just starting a series. It's called I'm Thankful For. So this morning we're going to learn about and practice being thankful for hope. So you can, thank you. So despite who's elected into office, this morning we are going to see how we as Christians are called to remain hopeful in response as God assures us that His will be accomplished regardless of ruler or circumstance. God's will be accomplished regardless of ruler or circumstance, and we are called as Christians to be hopeful. So this morning we're going to be opening up our Bibles. If you have one, awesome. You can open it up. If you have a cell phone, you can turn that on, and if not, we have slides for you. This morning we're going to be opening up to the Old Testament, to the book of Esther, chapter 4. So if you have one, you can do that, and I'll give you a chance to get there. While you're getting there, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Esther. Esther's a really, really interesting book. One of the reasons I chose Esther was, here's a fun fact, if you like Bible facts, trivia. Esther's one of the only, not the only, but one of the only books that God isn't mentioned one time. If you flip through the whole entire book of Esther, the Old Testament name for God, Yahweh or Yahweh, God is not mentioned one time in the entire book. That's interesting. So then how do we as Christians open up this book where the name God isn't explicitly mentioned or illustrated and lean into it? How do we learn from this book of Esther? Well, this morning we're going to be on the hunt for God. When we ask ourselves the question, where is God? We're going to be on the hunt. And we're going to be on the hunt for God's behind-the-scene activity as we look at a story here in Esther chapter 4. Yeah, so instead of descriptive illustrations or examples in the text, we're going to notice God working behind the scenes to accomplish His big purposes. That's what we're going to see this morning. The major point, the major idea this morning is this. If you just go back one. The major point is we are called to remain hopeful even when we cannot see God at work. Let me just replay. I want to all get in the same mind here. The major point this morning is we are called as Christians to remain hopeful even when we can't see God at work. So I want to give you a little bit of a history. Here's what's happening in the time of Esther in history, this point of history. So this story in Esther takes place 100 years after the Babylonian exile. And after the exile, this group of Jewish people, they're dispersed into all this land. And after things calm down, some Jews go back into Jerusalem and some Jews stay where they were dispersed. So the book of Esther is actually talking to the Jews who stood in their spot. specifically this spot called Susa, and it was the capital of the Persian Empire. 100 years after the Babylonian exile, there's a group of Jewish people in the Persian kingdom. And we're going to start moving into our story. Every good story has good characters, so this morning we're going to focus on 4 big characters. Here's the first 2, Esther and Mordecai. Mordecai is Esther's uncle. Esther is Mordecai's niece. Esther doesn't have any parents, so she was living with Mordecai. Those are the first 2 characters. They're Jewish. Mordecai and Esther are Jewish. And the next 2 characters that we're going to see in our text this morning is this guy named Ahasuerus. That's kind of hard to say. I'm going to nickname him Xerxes. That's one of his other names. So King Xerxes, this is kind of funny. It's almost like a soap opera. We're going to see this morning. Xerxes is a drunken pushover king. Dude loves to party. He loves to tilt some back. And he loves to, rule evilly. He's a pushover. So Esther, Mordecai, Xerxes, and the last guy we will see, like every good story, an evil, cunning villain named Haman. So I want to describe to you, we're going to be in chapter 4 this morning. And I would like to describe to you chapter 1, 2, and 3, and then we're going to move into our text together. So the book of Esther is really interesting. If we open it up together and we look into chapter 1, here's what happens. The text unveils this story, and this is what it says. King Xerxes throws this big old elaborate party. And he invites all the royal people in the kingdom to come. In the Persian Empire, he invites everybody who's important. He invites his buddies, his pals, the most talented, the most rich, the people who are part of his castle, so to speak. He invites them. And the purpose of Xerxes' party, ready for this? It was to show off the beauty of his wife, the queen. That was his main purpose. So the royal people had ways of doing invitations, so he extends this royal invitation to his wife. And he says, come to my party. So he throws this big old elaborate party, and everyone is there, and everyone important is there in the entire kingdom. And guess who doesn't show? His wife. His wife doesn't show. And he is absolutely humiliated. So his buddies, his royal officials say, hey, Xerxes, you look like a jerk. You look like you're pitiful, man. Here's what you really should do. You have all the power. Why don't you send us out into all the land so we can find you a new wife, a new queen. Because obviously this one ain't it. So that's what he does. We're moving into chapter 2 now. And this is what happens. In chapter 2, the king Xerxes, he sends out messengers into all the land to search for the most beautiful virgins that they can find. The most beautiful women who've never laid with another man. He brings them all in. And while these messengers are searching in the land for the most beautiful virgins, they come across one of our main characters, Esther. And the text says that Esther was really, really good looking. This is not my words, this is the text words. The text says that she was beautiful in figure. She was appealing to the eyes. So Esther gets brought in front of the king with all these other beautiful women. And Esther finds favor in the king's sight and becomes the new queen. Right after Esther is the new queen with King Xerxes, her uncle Mordecai is in the streets, and he overhears this evil plan. Some of the royal officials were planning to kill Xerxes. So Mordecai goes running to Esther and says, hey, someone's going to kill your new husband. You need to go protect him. And through Mordecai's story, the king's life is saved. Are you bearing with me? Thanks so much for paying attention. Now we're going to get to chapter 3. This is a long story, but we need to understand what's happening so we can move into chapter 4 effectively. Chapter 3, this is what happens. The villain arises. Xerxes elects a second guy in command right underneath him. And he elects this guy named Haman. And he says, Haman, you're the new guy in charge. You're right underneath me. Rule as you please. So this is what Haman does. Haman, in his self-righteous, evil self, he orders everyone in the kingdom to bow down to him. But there's one person who doesn't bow down. That's Mordecai. Mordecai does not bow down to this new guy, Haman. So now we're at the end of chapter 3, and I would like to pick up in our text. You can look down into your Bibles, or you can read with us on the screen. We are in Esther chapter 3. We're going to read verses 9 through 10. This is Haman before King Xerxes making a request. He says this, Xerxes, if it please the king, issue a decree that they, the Jews, will be destroyed. And I, Haman, will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators to be deposited into the royal treasury. The king, Xerxes, agreed, confirming his decision by removing his signet ring from his finger and giving it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said, the money and the people are both yours to do with as you see fit. I want to continue to read. Let's skip down to verse 13. Letters were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving the order that all the Jews, both young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. Haman is ticked off. Mordecai would not bow down. Instead of just taking it out on Mordecai, his plan is to take out all the Jews. I want to remind you of our main point, the direction that we're heading. The main point today is that we're called to remain hopeful even when we can't see God at work. Would you hit a slide, please? Here's point number 1. Mordecai wept, but remained hopeful. Let's read verse 1 together. When Mordecai learned about all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on burlap and ashes, and went out into the city crying with a loud and bitter wail. I mean, let's just take a step out of the text for a second and see, what would you feel like? What would that death sentence feel like? Imagine receiving that letter, going out to your mailbox in front of your house, opening that up and reading that all of your friends and family, your children, and your entire race are about to be taken out. Not just going to die, but literally are going to be slaughtered. It seemed like God was nowhere to be found. I mean, it seems like God is not on the scene, right? I mean, imagine getting a letter like that. Where are you, God? What are you doing? 2 of the most powerful rulers in the kingdom, King Xerxes and his new guy, Haman, royally chose that all the Jews in the whole entire Persian Empire were going to be slaughtered. And they sit back and they drank to it and said it was awesome. That's their decision. That was their rule. These 2 evil rulers and their plan to kill all the Jews. The text says that the king made a decree. And back in the day, when a king made a decree, it was absolutely irreversible. When a king took his ring, stamped it on something, it was official. Even if he wanted to change it, he couldn't. And he wrote this decree that all of them would be slaughtered and killed. And now the situation becomes hopeless. The situation was hopeless. Mordecai wept. Mordecai was a real human. He's not just a Bible figure. Mordecai was a real human just like us. And he's not like some sort of heavenly or religious robot who had no emotions, that had this crazy big old faith in God that didn't weep. The text says that he wept bitterly. Like, Mordecai knew the situation was so bad, he tore his clothes and wept and cried aloud in the city. But then the text doesn't stop there. It continues to describe Mordecai. Mordecai wept, but he remained hopeful. Let's take a look at Mordecai's hopefulness. Verse 7 and 8. Would you hit the slide for me, please? So there was this messenger, his name was Hathach, and he was relaying messages between Esther and himself. So Mordecai told Hathach, the messenger, the whole story, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay in the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree issued in Susa that called for the death of all the Jews. He asked Hathach to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. He also asked Hathach to direct her to go to the king and beg for mercy and plead for her people. Next slide, please. Let's continue to read in verse 14. He's directing this message to Esther. He's talking to Esther. He says, Esther, if you keep quiet and don't say anything at a time like this, deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. Mordecai wept bitterly and cried aloud and tore his clothes, but then we see his disposition changing as he remains hopeful. He didn't crumble. He didn't give up. Mordecai knew that the decree of the king was irreversible. The situation was absolutely hopeless. But Mordecai, in this text, has hope that God would use Esther's position as queen to protect his people. I was driving on the highway this week, and I had Pandora on. I had my little green Subaru cruising at 60, and this song came on Pandora, and I want to read to you the song. It really articulated what I think someone who's going through suffering could if they can. These words were just so powerful. Listen to this person crying out to God. This is his address to God. The songwriter writes, God, I do not understand this world. Everything is dying and is broken. Why do I see nothing but suffering? God, I'm asking, could this be your plan? Sin has taken over this whole land. Will you not say anything else to me? Really well said. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make this morning, it seems like our nation and our world is in a really tough spot. We're living in a really unique time in history right now. Our culture is growing further and further away from the biblical foundations in which we were founded. And then we find ourselves asking the question, where's God? Where are you, God? You know, I've seen more than a couple people in this congregation, more than a handful of people in this congregation over the past few months suffering. Circumstances that have come upon either them or their family that are absolutely uncontrollable. I've seen situations so heavy that it seems to be as heavy as a sentence of death. What I would like to say to you is, regardless of who's in office, regardless of what our governmental or cultural conditions are, or any other circumstances or situations in our life that seem to be out of our hands, like Mordecai, we're called to remain hopeful. Oh, P.S. Period. P.S. You are allowed to cry and be upset. If your situation is so heavy, so out of your hands, so uncontrollable, like Mordecai, you can weep and weep bitterly with anguish. Let your eyes well up with tears. That's healthy. Do all that, but remain hopeful. Would you hit the slide, please? We're making it through. Now we're at point 2. Here's point 2. We looked at Mordecai, now we're going to look at Esther. Point 2 is this. Esther was hesitant, but remained hopeful. Let's take a second to look at Esther's hesitancy. This is Esther responding to Mordecai's request to go before the king. In verse 11, let's read together. She says, Mordecai, all of the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that if anyone goes and appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die, unless the king holds out his golden scepter. And the king has not called me, Esther, to come into him for 30 days. Esther's hesitant. She's doubtful. She's doubtful that if she goes before the king, that she'll survive. She thinks she's going to die, actually. And she's also doubtful and hesitant to go before the king because she thinks if she makes this appeal for the Jews, it's going to be ineffective. That's her hesitancy. That's her doubt. I would like to continue to read in verses 13 to 14. Would you please click the slide? So Mordecai then sends this reply to Esther. He says, Esther, don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. But you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this? A few things just happened there. Esther and Mordecai are having this dialogue. They're going back and forth. Mordecai understood that although the situation seemed hopeless, that God was in control. His hope was that somehow God can use Esther's coincidental position as queen to be part of this bigger, huge, glorious, behind-the-scenes plan that God could have been working out. He was confident that if Esther did not respond to his request, that the Lord surely would use someone or something else to deliver all the Jews. That was his hope. And the dialogue continues. These two continue to relay messages back to each other. And here's Esther's response after that. Let's look to verses 16 and 17. Could we change that slide, please? Verse 16 and 17 says this. This is Esther replying back to Mordecai. Keep this in mind. She says, okay, Mordecai, go and gather all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go and see the king. And if I die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Okay, Esther was hesitant. Now she's getting along with the plan. She's seeing it. Here comes hope. She's arising. She says, okay, I'll go. If I die, I die. I'm going. She's hopeful in a hopeless situation. She says, okay. It was interesting what she had asked for, though, right? She asked for the Jews to fast. For those of you who don't know what fasting are, it's a time of abstaining from something. Usually it's food, but it doesn't have to be. But the time from abstaining from something to fixate your mind on something else. So I would like to talk to you this morning quickly about fasting and what it is and what it is not. Fasting is not used as some sort of spiritual or emotional manipulation to manipulate God's will. That's not what fasting is for. Fasting functions to fixate and focus our mind on something very serious and present it before the Lord. Fasting functions as a way to keep us desperate before God. We humble ourselves. We abstain from something to focus on something so much greater. And in this situation, Esther's saying, hey, Jews, hundreds of thousands of Jews that are in the Persian Empire, prayer right now is more important than food. That's how important prayer is. Like, we live off of food, but no, right now we're going to live off of prayer. So I guess the application for us is, when we face situations that we disapprove of, horrible situations that seem to be out of our hands, such as the presidency or the election, what are you going to do? Are you going to run to Twitter or Facebook to vent? Are you going to write 10 pages or 10 paragraphs on Facebook so people can hear your emotions? Or will you humble yourself before the mighty God? Gather your Christian brothers and sisters and ask, could we please get on our knees and cry before the holy God that he would somehow work his purposes, his big, grand purposes, and use this person in office to keep us hopeful, regardless of who it might be? As Christians, we're called to remain hopeful. The sermon is not about us, actually, though. So I'm sorry if I focused on that too much. The sermon is about God. And remember in the beginning of the sermon, I said, in Esther, God wasn't mentioned one time, so we're on the hunt. We're on the hunt for God, and where is he? Where could he be, where he seems nowhere to be found? So I'm not going to do a story spoiler. I'm not going to spoil the whole entire book for you, but I would like to tell you a little bit about what happens after chapter 4. So in the following chapters, God begins to use Esther's position as queen to accomplish his grand purposes. She ends up going before the king, King Xerxes, and she begs for the life of the Jews, and Esther ends up winning the king's favor. He grants her favor. And Ahasuerus, King Xerxes, ends up issuing a new decree. Remember, I told you that decree was irreversible. He couldn't undo that one. But he issues a new decree. And the new decree was that the Jews were now allowed to fight for their lives. In the following few chapters, the Jews end up fighting for their lives, and they end up defeating Haman. Haman ends up being killed, and all his people that were seeking to kill the lives of the Jews end up dead. And the Jews rise to become victorious. Did you see that? The Lord used a bizarre situation to work out a much greater and glorious plan, so that when we would look at it, we would worship. As Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was praying. And as he was praying, he was taken and arrested. And he was brought before royal officials. And these royal officials sentenced him to death. And they mocked him. And they beat him. They flogged him. They whipped him. And then they made him, Jesus Christ, carry the cross up a hill only to be crucified on it. And here's what Jesus said. It's really interesting. There's a similarity here. Here's what Jesus said on the cross. This is his cry of dereliction. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Where are you, God? This was horrific. This was unimaginable. The very Son of God in flesh, the God in flesh, dying on a tree. This was the absolute worst event in all of history. Where was God and what was he doing? When God seems nowhere to be found, he's behind the scenes working a much greater and glorious plan that you and I cannot sense or cannot see. 3 days later, after Jesus died, hanging there on the cross, they buried him, and then he rose, claiming victory over death. The most horrific event in all of history now is the most glorious one. As Christians, we now treasure the cross. So whether you're in a tough situation or not, every single person in here without Jesus sentence is death. Sin leaves us in a bad place before a holy God. But just as Esther went in to beg before the king on behalf of the Jews, so Christ begs for us. So Christ stands before the throne of God pleading our case. The scripture actually speaks of Jesus being our advocate. And this is where our hope comes from. If you're in Christ, you have an advocate, one who prays for you, and one who begs your cause. Our lives, as we place our faith in Jesus, are saved. God the Father has mercy and extends to us favor. He reverses the irreversible sentence of death that we have to life because of Jesus. We have victory. We have an eternal hope, no matter what the situation. I'm going to pray for us, and then we're going to move into communion.